First off, thank you everyone for being here. I really do appreciate it. Thank you also to the Commonwealth and the Alexa Rose Foundation for the opportunity. It means the world to me. All right, tonight I'm going to talk about this massive mural I created during my residency and also the evolution of my artistic practice over the last 20 years or so. So let's start by rewinding a little bit. Let's go back in time to the beginning. That's maybe a touch too far. I don't know what kind of art I was doing there, but still a little too early. Let's move forward. All right. This is a proper beginning, I think. This was when I decided against all common sense to pursue a degree in art, much to my parents' dismay. And here you can see the obligatory first-year art student self-portrait. Once I graduated, I secured an art studio in Seattle's International District and got to work. I can't recall exactly why, but at this time I was drawn to creating art from product packaging and other everyday objects. I do know I was greatly inspired by the American painter Larry Rivers, how he was able to take ordinary everyday objects and create something worth looking at. In a word, art. I also appreciated how he incorporated text into his paintings as well. He used a lot of stenciling in his work, making the text a more rudimentary part of his visual language. Here are a few more examples of some of my early paintings, celebrating the mundane, the seemingly nondescript. There was this great Japanese grocery store within walking distance of my studio called Awajimaya in the International District. I loved that place. It had a bookstore too. I could get lost in there. And as you can see, I really enjoyed perusing the candy aisle. I was fascinated by their product branding and packaging. At this time, I also really keyed into the concept of consumerism, likely because I had no money. I was fascinated by the visual language of marketing, how all these logo marks and brand colors and taglines become a lingo unto themselves, shouting over top of one another for attention, and how we, the public, embrace this language and we use it as a means of communicating loyalty or status. At the same time, George Bush the Jr. was just getting us into what would become a decades-long mess in the Gulf. So I responded accordingly with this multi-paneled piece called Selling the War, incorporating words and concepts Bush used to justify his invasion. On the left, you see the piece installed in the hallway of the couple who purchased it. Another piece from around this time, again sort of railing against consumerism and capitalism. Like I said, I was a practicing artist. I had no money. But people in this country seem to especially love money, sometimes just for the sake of collecting it, it would seem. Also during these years, I made this self-portrait. This was one of my first forays into playing with the pixelated image, my face fractured by the lettering, almost like looking through glass block. I was awarded a grant by the King County Department of Public Health to create a piece of artwork for an anti-smoking initiative. I again leveraged packaging and marketing to put together this multi-paneled piece. My next target was Big Pharma, 48 panels here, and though they are much smaller, they are no less garish in their color, all competing for our attention in the local drugstore aisle. A potential buyer wanted a replica of the first Selling the War piece, but I refused, even for double my asking price. I felt it would be boring to recreate the same piece again. I also thought it would be unfair to the original purchaser. Instead, I created an all-new set using 36 completely different products. In 2005, I decided living month to month wasn't optimal. And through a series of twists and turns, I managed to reestablish my career in web and software design. In this interactive prototype for Expedia, you can again see my fascination with pixelation. My design career began to provide me with a comfort and security I'd never known in my life. However, I didn't stop painting during those years. You can see how intentional I am with color in these paintings, shapes of color with defined boundaries, a sort of pixelation in its own right. finding a whole spectrum of color in something as mundane as asphalt. Another thing you might notice with these is that they're all square format, long a preference of mine, perhaps a subconscious nod to the square as the simplest basic form, same as a pixel. In 2023, I decided to pursue my MFA in creative writing and started a low residency program at UNR Lake Tahoe. The following spring, my husband and I moved from Washington State to Boise to be closer to my family. As part of that move, I wanted to rededicate myself to my artistic practice. That winter, I discovered gel plate transfer. Gel plates are made of a rubbery, transparent material that can accept acrylic paint and then release the image onto a substrate. In the videos I watched online, it all looked quite magical. This is my first attempt at gel plate transfer. But there is no such thing as failure in art making, is there? We learn and we try again, and here you see my second attempt, much better. In my experimentation, I kept a log, making notes to myself how I might do something differently next time to see if it made a difference. Amount of paint applied, for example, or how long to let the plate set before pulling. By spring, I was confident enough to try larger prints, and I made this set of 15 plates, each containing a line from a prose poem I wrote for an open mic reading at my MFA program. As a result, I became more interested in utilizing typography as both a design element and a literal means of communicating an idea in my art. And then over the summer, I applied for the Commonwealth residency, and to my surprise and delight, I was awarded a spot for the fall. So 6 months to work in this space. What to do? Well, I knew immediately I wanted to use the time and space to push the medium of gel plate transfer to an extreme. I also knew I wanted to return to my politically minded roots. Quick detour here. Very timely, this showed up on my social media feed this weekend, an op-ed piece in Le Monde by filmmaker Xavier Dolan. And I just love this snippet so much I had to share it, especially the last bit. All art is political. It participates in the advancement, the maintenance, and the care of the community. The universe, and by universe I mean algorithm, was also kind enough to drop this in front of me last week. This idea of text and letters and symbols and notation combining and creating a new language. It's something that really resonates with me, something that I see in my work, including this mural. We are very good at deriving meaning. We're clever, we humans. We're models of efficiency. We all instantly know what these symbols mean. We're adept at communicating complexity through seeming simplicity. And we can also see through obfuscation. Again, here I'm seeing how much I can get away with without losing meaning entirely. This is something I've been playing with this week, assembling abstracted letter forms on a grid with these shapes I cut out of paper. You may not know how to read sheet music, but if you stare at this image while I do this, da-na-na-na, da-na-na-na, well then you've made the connection between the image and the sounds it represents. Everyone here is familiar with a Snickers bar. We've been programmed to recognize it by its shape and color, the blue font, in effect its packaging and the associated marketing that goes along with it. Matt Rosenman creates videos where he talks about food packaging and advertising, and he does these clever rebranding exercises to show how powerful this language is and how effective in subtly communicating ideas to our subconscious. Here are the examples from his Snickers exercise. Snickers for healthy hiker types, naturally sweetened. Snickers for kids, contains essential nutrients. Snickers energy bar with electrolytes. Snickers for keeping slim, thoughtfully portioned. And Snickers for bulking up, 8 grams of protein. It really is quite amazing, isn't it? With my piece, I wanted to create a visual language to communicate my ideas. I liked the idea of a deck of playing cards or a pack of collectible cards, like I was curating a bespoke collection of 30 Americans. And I've long admired Andy Warhol, and this gel plate transfer process immediately brought him to mind. I certainly drew inspiration from his portraiture as my plans for the mural began to take shape. Here's a triple portrait of the painter Egon Schiele. I made this over the summer, and it's clearly a nod to Warhol. But at the size I was going for with the mural, I figured I'd have to push the halftone to the extreme. This is another Warhol piece that I was definitely looking at. Supposedly, by the way, this is also his first ever commission. All right, let's get into it. Here's an early digital mock-up of the mural. Another benefit of gel plate transfer for me is that by its very nature, it demands input from both my digital side and my analog side. Much of the work takes place on the computer up front before being executed by hand in the studio. I spent countless hours researching which Americans I wanted to include in my collection of portraits. They needed to be somebody I admired in some way and famous enough to be recognized by most viewers. That was important to me. I wanted them to resonate with people. And core to the theme of my piece was this idea that the almighty dollar is the actual symbol of America, perhaps more recognizable and more worshipped than even our flag. At its core, as Americans of good conscience, is my considered reaction to the unhealthy American obsession with money, wealth, fame, and power through this curation of thoughtful voices. As I began to design the final composition for each portrait, I typed my chosen quotes by hand on an old Smith Corona typewriter I'd picked up at an estate sale on Warm Springs last year for $40. Again, blending the analog with the digital. Here's an example of a single portrait broken into its 5x7 grid and including a primary, secondary, and a tiny tertiary quote. I wanted viewers to move in close and explore each portrait and their corresponding quotes, then step back to engage with the larger pixelated image and the symbolism that communicates its own distinctive meaning. I had to export each of those individual squares, then re-import them back into Illustrator on separate numbered artboards with crop marks, which I then printed and cropped to size with an X-Acto knife. I also had to do the same for masks I created to block in the skin tone. Here you can see me setting up at my desk right over there in that first cubby. I'm prepped for a run of 5 plates with the black and white Xeroxes ready to go down first, followed by the masks used to apply the skin tones before I pull the prints from the plates onto the substrate with the background color. But let's talk about color. Here's my pixelated dollar bill image broken down into 8 shades of gray. And here, the black squares represent color number 8, the darkest shade. And I think it's interesting, actually, with just these few blips on the screen, that the dollar image still more or less holds up. And this is what I love exploring in my work. What is the bare minimum necessary to be recognized? It's amazing how our brains fill in the gaps. We're very, very good at this, I think, deriving meaning from clues through our innate desire to make sense of the world. I approximated the range of color I wanted to use for the dollar bill and the skin tone, and then mixed each of the 16 colors by hand until I was happy with the result. The goal wasn't to replicate what I'd done on the computer so much as to satisfy my eye on the paper. I was very anxious about mixing enough paint for each color. So, as one does, I employed a kitchen scale, estimating I would need about 1 gram of paint for each tile print. Each color required vastly different amounts of paint, though, ranging from 60 squares or grams to 268 for the lightest color. It was a tedious process, but it ensured I would have a consistent color palette across all 30 portraits. My worst nightmare was I get to panel number 29 and I've run out of a color or two, and I'd have to remix those, and maybe they just aren't quite the right shade, and I would have lost a lot of sleep over that. Throughout November and December, I constructed the panels in my garage. Here, my brother is lending a much-needed hand on shop day in my driveway. There were many, many shop days. There was much ripping of plywood and gluing and clamping and puttying and sanding and taping and gessoing and then gluing on a top sheet of paper. I'm not going to lie, the panels were difficult and time-consuming, and they didn't all come out perfectly square or flat. But I wasn't interested in perfection or in hiding how this piece was made or the materiality of it. Just the opposite, in fact. Its imperfections are a testament of it being made by hand. And as you can see, all those heavy art books that I've collected over the years really came in handy for when I was gluing down the paper. Here are a handful of early test prints exploring color and this idea of 5-inch tiles. These sort of prove the model, and I thought, okay, I can make this work. But here's another tile exploration, pulling prints directly onto gessoed wood panel, which as you can see didn't work very well. This was why I decided to mount paper onto my panels, which worked much better. But before I started in on the 30 panel piece, I decided to do a full prototype. So I did a panel of David Bowie, one of my heroes, one of my non-American heroes, I guess. He couldn't be included in the final piece because he wasn't technically an American, even though he did live in New York City for 20 or so years. And so after all the experimentation and the planning and figuring, production, the actual printmaking, finally could begin in earnest. Portrait number 1 was the writer James Baldwin, another hero of mine. That felt good, but you can see a little bit of white patchiness here and there. I hadn't quite dialed in the process, but I found that that didn't happen quite as much as I went along. It's amazing how much you learn by just doing over and over and over again. But it was the second portrait, George Carlin. Seeing them side by side, this was a real aha moment. Okay, I think this could work. They look cool together. I can see the corner of a dollar bill there. So I started getting excited. I only had 28 more to go. Joan Didion came next, and so it went, one panel at a time, each comprised of 35 individual prints, each square or pixel serving multiple duties or multiple intentions. And some days it was super tedious. Other days, the time flew by in a flash. It was crazy. I just put my headphones on, put a good playlist on. I listened to a lot of Prince. I actually made a playlist of all of Prince's music from his very first album all the way up to say the mid-90s. And it's a lot. It's a huge catalog. And I listened to that playlist twice during this project, but it maybe got me through, 20% of it. I highly recommend doing that, by the way, if you're a Prince fan. The first portrait, James Baldwin, took me about 7 hours in the studio, just the printmaking process. But by the final weeks, I was able to complete a portrait in about 3.5 hours, so about half the time. Like I said earlier, we are creatures of efficiency. And in the end, with the support of my fellow artists and the guidance afforded me by the wonderful folks here at the Commonwealth, I completed my mural in January, a bit ahead of time. 30 portraits, 90 pearls of wisdom, 1,050 individual prints, 360 hours spent here in the studio, give or take. And that is how we got here from there. Thank you for joining me on this trip.